all of us in the Capitol, all of us across the nation, wish for the speedy recovery of Officer Shaver and mourn the loss of another fallen hero. To pay tribute to his final act of bravery, Officer Evans will lie in honor under the Capitol Rotunda, at the very center of the democracy he gave his life to protect. A service in his memory will take place tomorrow morning. For everyone who works in the Senate, his loss is particularly painful. He was a familiar face who greeted lawmakers, reporters, staffers, and employees at the north entrance as we entered the Senate side of the building. Whether you knew him or not, his wide smile was often the first thing you'd see in the morning. This has been an immensely difficult few months for members of the Capitol Police Force and for everyone who works behind the scenes to safeguard the Capitol complex. Senate committees are conducting bipartisan and comprehensive reviews to ensure the Capitol is secure as possible, while also remaining accessible to the public. That's a top priority. But also, in this moment of profound loss, we need to comfort each other and support members of the Capitol Police who in 4 short months suffered a brutal attack by a violent mob and lost 4 of their friends and cherished colleagues. We must never, never take for granted the work they do day in and day out to guard this citadel of democracy. I'll have more to say tomorrow when we pay tribute to the life of Officer Evans. For now, I wish to extend my deep condolences to his friends and family, especially his 2 young children, and everyone whose lives were enriched by knowing this incredible, incredible public servant. Now, on an entirely another matter. As the Senate returns to work this week, we're going to pick back right up where we left off, aggressively filling the Biden administration with well-qualified nominees and pursuing timely legislation that meets the needs of the American people. This week, the Senate will vote on the nominations of Polly Trottenberg to serve as Deputy Secretary of Transportation, Wendy Sherman to serve as Deputy Secretary of State, Gary Gensler to serve on the Security and Exchange Commission, and Brenda Mallory to be a member of the Council on Environmental Quality. Each is exceptionally well qualified for their respective position, and each, I expect, will receive bipartisan support here on the floor. And I'm particularly proud of Polly Trottenberg, who was my legislative director and legislative assistant on transportation, I believe for it was 9 years. She then served as Commissioner of Transportation in New York City. And one of the things, of course, Madam President, that I talked to her about regularly was getting Gateway, our much-needed tunnel built under the Hudson, so needed by New York, New Jersey, and the entire Northeast Corridor. The Senate will also debate on legislation from Senator Hirono and Representative Meng to address the surge of anti-Asian hate crimes during the COVID pandemic. Over the past year, we've read horrible accounts of violence and discrimination against Asian Americans, spurred on by ignorance and xenophobia and the vicious slander that blames the Chinese people for COVID-19. Slander that was often encouraged and repeated so regrettably. I so regret that a president would stoop to that level. But it was encouraged and repeated by the former president, who seems to almost revel in advancing bigotry. Sadly, the recent spate of anti-Asian violence is not a new chapter in American history. From the Chinese massacre of 1871 to the explicitly racist Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese American citizens, and the shameful Korematsu Supreme Court decision, the Asian American community has long suffered the hammer blows of racism, bigotry. We cannot let this new surge, which contains echoes of these violent chapters in our history, go unaddressed. So this week, the Senate will vote on Senator Hirono's anti-Asian hate crimes bill. The bill does 2 things. I know, Madam President, that you are a proud sponsor of that legislation. The bill does 2 things. First, It tells the Department of Justice they need to make consideration of these hate crimes a top priority during this pandemic. There's a scourge of abuse happening to the Asian American community, shamefully aided and abetted by former President Trump, and it needs to be prioritized by law enforcement more than it is right now. And second, it sends a very important signal from the Congress of the United States to the American public. These crimes will not be tolerated, and there will be consequences. This legislation is as common sense and straightforward as it gets. It's as unobjectionable as it gets. I should expect our work on Senator Hirono's hate crimes bill to be thoroughly bipartisan. President Biden has urged Congress to swiftly pass this legislation and send it to his desk. Let's get it done this week. I attended 4 or 5, maybe even more, rallies against anti-Asian violence. And I was heartsick to hear stories. An elderly man just afraid to walk out on the street, that he might be ridiculed, spat upon. A young lady who didn't want to travel the subways because of the glares and stares from some people at her because of her Asian ancestry. And the story could be repeated over and over again, and unfortunately this bigotry often ended in violence. We must stop it as Americans. We all know, every one of us, that racism against one is racism against all. We must stop it, and again, I plead with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle to let this legislation, it seems so unobjectionable, go forward and pass with strong bipartisan vote. Again, let's get it done this week. On infrastructure, finally, over the last several months, the Biden administration has said that it will push comprehensive infrastructure and jobs bill in coordination with the Congress. This effort could not come at a better time. The American Rescue Plan is already delivering on its promise to lift the country out of the COVID crisis and set our economy back on the path to recovery. Over the state work period, I visited scores of restaurants, like Essie's in Mount Carmel and Russo's Grill in Amsterdam, that are now receiving a crucial lifeline of assistance from the American Rescue Plan. I visited small and independent stages and venues, like the Bug Jar in Rochester, which will soon receive grants through the Save Our Stages Act. And I met with community organizations to hear about how New York families are receiving thousands of dollars per child through the expanded tax credit. They will be receiving that. And that's a policy that's going to lift millions of American children out of poverty during a time of economic hardship for so many. The American Rescue Plan is helping the country recover from the worst public health crisis in a century, the worst economic crisis in 3/4 of a century. Now, not later, now is the time to build on that solid foundation to create jobs and cement a robust economy. The next big step is a long overdue investment, a large and significant investment in our nation's infrastructure. We know that our nation's roads and bridges and railways and waterways and ports are in need of an overhaul. So too does our country need investment in modern infrastructure projects, like our electric grid, broadband internet access, and 5G, just to name a few. President Biden's proposal will address both our traditional infrastructure needs and invest in 21st century infrastructure projects that America sorely needs. Again, this very important work should be bipartisan. This is an issue that affects all 50 states. Our two parties used to agree on the need to reliably invest in infrastructure. We should be able to do that again. President Biden is hosting bipartisan discussions about his proposal at the White House today, and will continue to bring lawmakers and stakeholders together to find common ground. I know that the administration is going to talk to members from both sides of the aisle to incorporate their ideas. Every day now, millions of Americans are getting the vaccine, 4 million on one day over the weekend. And we're closer than ever to defeating the COVID-19 pandemic. The worst of COVID-19 is hopefully in the rearview mirror. The streets of New York City this weekend, as I wandered about, were more alive than I've seen them in months. Soon we'll have an opportunity to work together to strengthen our recovery and create the jobs of the future. A big, bold investment in our nation's infrastructure is just the way to do it. I yield the floor. Madam President,
Majority Leader.